When I say the word Inquisition, what is it that comes into your mind? Now, I'm not going to pretend to be able to read your mind, but I imagine that for a lot of people, it conjures up images of things like secret police, excessive religious oppression, and a whole bunch of people being burned at the stake. But is that really what it was? Okay, right off the bat, I'm not going to be arguing in this video that the medieval Inquisition was actually a really great thing and that we should be bringing it back or anything. I'm personally a big fan of human rights and religious freedom. But the Inquisition is definitely misunderstood in popular culture for a variety of reasons, including a long and complicated, highly biased historiography. Instead, in this video, I'm hoping to take a much more complex and nuanced look at the Inquisition, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a better understanding of how it was understood and perceived in the Middle Ages, and its place in medieval society more broadly. Oh, and this video is going to be on the medieval Inquisition specifically. The early medieval Spanish, Portuguese, and Roman Inquisitions changed enough by that point that they should really be considered their own thing, although they are outgrowths, ultimately, of the medieval Inquisition. With all that said, let's get into it. Heresy was recognized fairly early on in Christianity to be a problem. In a religion where belief was connected to the salvation of the soul, someone who believed something wrong, and who tried to convince others to follow their errors, was not only a danger to themselves, but to the society as a whole, since they risked dragging others down with them. In the beginning, when Christian communities were only one part of the larger social fabric, excommunication alone was seen as a good solution to this. At this time, excommunication wasn't just that this person couldn't take part in communion, but they were actually shunned and excluded from the community at large. And we still see this form of social exclusion today in very tightly knit communities like the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. This also helps avoid awkward Thanksgiving dinners. Not that Jehovah's Witnesses celebrate Thanksgiving. Well, neither did early Christian groups, but anyway. The remedy for this heresy was through dialogue, convincing one's brothers and sisters in Christ that they'd made a mistake and that they should return to orthodoxy, which literally means correct belief. By the way, when I use the term heretic throughout this video, I want to make it clear that I'm not making any personal judgments as to who's right or who's wrong. I'm saying heretic to denote the groups which the eventual Catholic Church would see as such, because it's their perception of who's a heretic that matters when talking about the Inquisition. Obviously, though, these people wouldn't have seen themselves as heretics. But turning back to the history, things changed when Christianity became the official and dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity was much more closely tied to the state, and it was more difficult to make it so that all Christians avoided someone who was rejected as a heretic. Also, in a Christian state, the state itself was, well, Christian. And so the social danger that was heresy became more impactful and even political. Because of this, we see two changes taking place at this time. On the one hand, emperors now started using secular means to get rid of this danger, punishing heretics with property confiscation and exile in most cases. On the theological front, figures like Augustine of Hippo began to argue that secular means were justified in dealing with this social problem, though for Augustine it was especially a matter of forcing the most stubborn who wouldn't listen to reason to finally take a look at the evidence for correct belief, which they were just too obstinate to consider without it. A former professor of mine made a pretty good analogy for understanding this idea. Imagine I'm trying to convince you that there are elves in the back of the room, and you, fairly understandably maybe, are thinking that I'm full of it. Like, there's no way that there are actually elves in the back of the room. You laugh me off, you think I'm trying to trick you or something. And no matter how much I tell you that there are elves in the back of the room, and that elves exist, you don't believe me. In this analogy, then, secular punishment is equivalent to me physically turning your head, forcing you to look at the back of the room to see that there are actually elves there. I'm not forcing you to believe in elves, but I'm forcing you to look at the undeniable truth that elves do in fact exist. The reason why I focus on this is because This logic was very important for underpinning the Inquisition and the persecution of heretics more generally. You don't have to agree with this logic. I have some problems of my own with it, but understanding it is important for understanding why heretic persecution was a thing and why it could be supported by people in the Middle Ages. With all that said, the death penalty wasn't all that big for heresy in late antiquity. We only have a single recorded instance of it happening, and even then it was strongly opposed by Pope Siricius, Martin of Tours, and Ambrose of Milan, Augustine's mentor and arguably the most influential bishop of the day. Exile and imprisonment were preferred so that the heretic would have an opportunity to return to the church at some point. While heresy continued to be a big issue in the Eastern Empire, the West saw a lot less of it in the early Middle Ages. There, the church was more concerned with converting pagans, and the errors of converts were seen more as incomplete conversion than anything else. It was seen as an issue in the church, but usually not as bad as heresy, and there wasn't really anyone who was promoting these things. Any groups that could really be called heretics were small and passed under the radar for the most part. This started to change in the 11th century, around the same time as the Gregorian reforms, which began to place a much greater emphasis on Rome and Roman practice and belief, with other parts of the Christian world expected to conform. This is the environment which ultimately led to the official split between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, and if you've watched my last video on perceptions of medieval Ireland, you may remember that Ireland's perceived slowness in its conformity played a part in the Irish being viewed by outsiders as quasi-pagan barbarians. This also meant that more and more people were starting to have fundamental disagreements with the church. From the Catholic point of view, more heretics. When you constrict the definition of what it is to be correct, more people are going to fall outside of that sphere. And this also meant that the church was just more conscious of incorrectness at the time, and they generally cared about it more. But the Inquisition still wasn't really a thing yet, and heresies were pretty small and localized, meaning that they were seen as a local issue. And it was up to the local bishop or priests to deal with them as they saw fit, to try and convince them to come back to the fold, and occasionally turn them over to the secular authorities if they deemed it necessary. By the 12th century, these heresies became more difficult to deal with. Figures like Arnold of Brescia, Peter of Bruy, and Henry of Lausanne started to acquire more widespread support, and they often managed to escape the authorities' attempts to suppress them. This really came to a head with the emergence of two of the most important heresies of the Middle Ages, the Cathars, also known as Albigensians, and the Waldensians. Now, I'm not going to go over their entire histories and belief systems in this video, but one of the things that was significant about them is that they didn't just criticize the Catholic Church, they straight up rejected it. They had their own beliefs, their own rituals, and their own clergy, so it wasn't enough to just tell their followers that their beliefs were rejected by official Catholic doctrine, because they just didn't care. The church realized that it had to do a lot more to deal with heresy, eventually requiring that all bishops take responsibility to root out heresy within their own diocese. Since the emphasis was still on converting heretics back to orthodoxy, preaching campaigns took place. But since these groups tended to be highly critical of priests themselves and their pomp and ostentatiousness, preachers like Saint Dominic, who lived a far more simple lifestyle, tended to be more successful, which eventually even led to the creation of the Dominican order, also known as the Order of the Preachers. But preaching could only get you so far, as Augustine had told centuries before, and heretics were still seen as a social danger. They needed to be removed for the sake of people's souls. But heretics tended to be secretive, knowing that their beliefs could get them into trouble. So the church had to develop a method to find them and determine who was a heretic and who wasn't. Trials had been taking place for heresy since the beginning, but the nature of trials and law was changing by the late 12th century. You see, in order to condemn someone in medieval courts, you needed certainty, and this meant either confession or the testimony of at least two reliable, trustworthy, and morally upright witnesses. This, of course, wasn't always possible, so in the first half of the Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon to turn to a trial by ordeal in order to ask for divine intervention in determining someone's guilt. Now, trial by ordeal is another one of those things which are generally misunderstood, and I'll most likely release another separate, shorter video at some point explaining them. But by the end of the 12th century and into the 13th, intellectuals started to look down upon them, both because they were starting to see them as unreliable, and also due to the perceived arrogance of calling on God for a miracle whenever you wanted one. And they were ultimately banned by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. A new system had to be developed, and the architect of the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III, was the perfect person to do so. You see, by this point, Roman law was being revived in the West, and before becoming Pope, Innocent had studied law at the University of Bologna, which was renowned as the best place to do so. In wanting to establish a more rational process for investigating heresy, he sent clergymen of good repute to areas with a known heretical presence to investigate and inquire. That is, inquisitors. And thus the Inquisition was born, though it wasn't really an institution so much as a specific pastoral duty given to certain clerics, mostly to assist the local bishop. It also wasn't exclusive for investigating heresy. It investigated serious violations of canon law more generally, though eventually the Officium Inquisitionis would be distinguished as the branch specifically dedicated to searching for heretics, whereas other sort of inquisitors would be investigating other types of violations of canon law. Though when most people say and talk about the Inquisition, what they mean is this Officium Inquisitionis, which was tasked with following heresy. It was really with Pope Gregory IX that inquisitorial missions started to become a big thing, and he also made them independent from the local clergy. This did cause some problems, though, and after several popes went back and forth on the matter, the Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312 affirmed that the decisions of inquisitors needed to be confirmed by the local bishops in order to prevent any abuse, and I'll talk about this more later on in the video. So, how did the Inquisition actually work? Well, the first thing that happened when an inquisitor came to town is that he gathered everyone up for a sermon. Remember, the main objective of the Inquisition is to convert heretics, so the hope was that any heretics willing to listen to reason would hear the sermon and be willing to confess and to convert back to proper Orthodox Catholic Christianity. This is actually part of the reason why so many inquisitors were Dominican friars, because the church hoped to convince heretics to convert more than anything else, and Dominicans were expert professional preachers. After the sermon, called the Predicatio Generalis, the inquisitor explained to the locals why he was there, and he called upon them to testify as witnesses or provide leads for their investigation. He also called upon heretics to repent, and established a grace period during which they could do so with a lighter penance, which could last anywhere from 8 days to over a month in some cases. During that grace period and afterwards, the inquisitor and his team would investigate leads in order to build cases. I say team with emphasis here because inquisitors were in no way working alone. They relied on a large number of helpers, representatives, heralds, scribes, notaries, lawyers, and others for the whole thing to work. Some of these people were clergy as well, but some were laymen, as was usually the case for notaries. They also relied heavily on local cooperation, with secular authorities often summoning the accused to the inquisitorial court, and also holding them in custody during the trial. One thing that was fairly unique about the inquisitorial process was how every lead was thoroughly investigated to determine its truthfulness, which meant that investigations could last for years. When it came to claims made against someone, the informant's reputation, the sincerity of their confession of their own sins, and their relationship with the accused were all taken into account. If there was any animosity between a witness and the accused, they were not considered reliable. Denunciations needed to be out of love and not out of hatred. In most courts, this meant that the accused was allowed to know the name of their accusers, but witnesses in heresy cases were kept anonymous out of fear of retribution. So instead, the accused could provide a list to the inquisitor of their rivals who might bear false witness against them. If, after investigation, the inquisitor felt like there was no real reason to suspect the accused, the charges could just be dropped. Otherwise, it would proceed to the hearing, which was another unique aspect of the inquisitorial process. How the hearing proceeded depended on what kind of evidence had been acquired at that point. If there was no evidence beyond rumor and poor reputation, the accused could swear an oath of faithfulness to the church and be on their merry way. That is, as long as their oath could be trusted. People of poor repute, like prostitutes or known liars, would still have to do some sort of penance. If, however, there was evidence of their heresy, be it witnesses or something else, the accused had to prove themselves innocent of the charges. For example, by undermining the credibility of the witness or providing reliable witnesses of their own. If they denied charges of heresy and none of the evidence against them was considered rock solid, they could get the help of a lawyer. But if there was any evidence which the inquisitor deemed undeniable, no lawyer was seen as necessary, since at that point the only thing that he could do was help the accused defend the heresy itself, which was seen as completely absurd. In these cases, the accused were more there to explain themselves rather than defend themselves, and the hearing became more akin to confession than a debate. The inquisitor asked the accused all sorts of questions about their views, their beliefs, their associations, and they gave them the opportunity to recant. All of this was meant to help them find any other lingering heretics, with inquisitors often far more interested in uncovering heretic leaders than they were with the followers, as well as determining what sort of penance was appropriate for a heretic who did ultimately convert. Someone who confessed their sins openly and early on and cooperated fully was seen as being more sincere and deserving of lighter penance than someone who withheld information which the inquisitor already knew from his investigation, someone who broke their oath, or, worst of all, someone who tried to defend their heretical views. Of course, not everyone confessed to being a heretic even when there was strong evidence against them. But if there weren't enough reliable witnesses to testify, and the secretive nature of heresy often made this difficult to obtain, the court couldn't declare them guilty without a confession. There were, however, ways to make someone confess. If the other evidence was very strong and the inquisitor was absolutely certain of the person's guilt, they could try to make them confess in a couple of ways. The most common was a prison sentence. After some time in a cell, many were willing to confess after a few weeks, though in exceptional cases, some held out for a number of years. The second method, employed after it was made legal in ecclesiastical courts in 1252, was torture. Though many were still opposed to this, and it was used far less often than most people assume. Torture was more common in secular courts than it was in ecclesiastical ones. Someone who confessed under torture then had to confess again, willingly, in front of the tribunal in order to affirm that it was a genuine confession. Now, in the modern day, I'm sure many of us would take issue with these methods, no matter how certain the inquisitor was. Again, I'm not here to defend the Inquisition. But for a lot of inquisitors, the burden of proof was quite high, and they were a lot more willing to acquit someone in an ambiguous case than they were to sentence them, because they didn't want to accidentally sentence someone who was innocent. In fact, the majority of people who were put on trial for heresy in the Middle Ages were acquitted. That being said, this wasn't always the case. Some overly zealous inquisitors were very quick to condemn, like the infamous Konrad von Marburg, who spread the belief that heretics were making sacrifices to the devil and were, therefore, an immediate danger, having to be dealt with quickly, which led many of them being burned at the stake. There's also the issue of leading questions and biased interpretations of the evidence, something which led many followers of the Beguine and Begard movement, who lived communal, semi-monastic lifestyles without taking specific religious vows, and who were looked at with a whole lot of suspicion by the church, to be accused and sometimes even condemned of following the so-called free spirits heresy, a heresy that in all likelihood never actually existed. The situation is pretty similar to that of the witch trials in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, but that's a whole different can of worms which I do not have time to talk about right now. That's going to have to be for a different video. In any case, the trial ended with a sentencing ceremony, the Sermo Generalis, which was a public affair. Those who recanted their heresy had their excommunications lifted and were publicly assigned their penance. Those who refused to renounce their heretical beliefs were handed over to the Brachium Saeculare, the secular arm of the law. The vast majority of those found guilty recanted and were given penance. If you're surprised by this, you should remember, once again, that the Church's view has always been that heretics ought to be converted. The 12th century theologian Peter Cantor believed that heretics being killed discredited the Church because it implied that their beliefs were too weak to convince the heretics that they were true. On the other hand, conversions discredited the heresy. Also, the Church's primary concern, explicitly speaking anyway, was the well-being of people's souls, and things like torture were seen as a bodily, temporary sacrifice in order to save the soul, which was eternal. Of course, heresy was still a major crime, and even those who converted weren't going to get completely off the hook for it. Their sin required penance, though the exact level of penance depended on several factors. Like I mentioned earlier, their conduct during the trial was thought to be a sign of the sincerity of their confession and the condition of their souls, and it helped the inquisitor, often with the help of others, including legal experts, to determine how severe their penance should be. Another factor was their relationship to the heresy. Someone who helped a heretic or who had visited heretical meetings only a few times was in less trouble than someone who sincerely believed in the heresy, and even they were due a lighter penance than one of the heresy's leaders. Penance usually had a public and a private component. The penitent often had to wear yellow crosses on their clothes for a certain number of years. They might be required to go on a number of pilgrimages, either local or major pilgrimages, possibly even go on crusade if there was one taking place. They were also frequently required to take part in public ceremonies, sometimes even whipping themselves publicly, or simply standing in front of a church and confessing loudly. These measures were meant to humble them while also deterring others from making the same mistake. More private penance could include fasting or abstaining from certain foods, attending Mass on Sundays and all liturgical holidays, reciting the Office of the Hours, and of course you got your classic Our Fathers and Hail Marys. Or, well, in this case it would probably be more like Pater Nosters and Ave Marias. Some of these things were limited in time, but the severity of heresy meant that some of the penances were meant to be performed for life. Of course, the inquisitor or local bishop could put an end to them at any time if he thought that the penitent deserved as much. Wealthier penitents might also be asked to make a donation to the church, and donations could often be offered to substitute other forms of penance. Those who were particularly uncooperative or high-ranking could receive very serious penances, including confinement to prison, possibly even for life. This was done in a minority of cases. Most people were allowed to live freely doing their penance under the supervision of their parish priest, and even the majority of those imprisoned were allowed to have occasional guests, or their imprisonment might be more confinement to a monastery. But those who the inquisitor thought needed the most severe penance could be strictly confined, even chained to a wall for the rest of their lives. Prison sentences themselves were not a typical form of punishment in the Middle Ages. They were usually a way of holding people until the day of their trial or until the day of a different punishment. But for the Catholic Church, this was the most extreme form of penance that they could conceive of. Even still, the majority of those sentenced to prison, at least the less confining version, were eventually released. For example, the Inquisition records of the Bishop of Pamiers, Jacques Fournier, state that of the 32 people confined to murus largus, the less strict imprisonment, between the years 1318 and 1325, 24 of them, so all but 6, had been released, with sentences ranging from 11 months to the longest at 8 years. For those who didn't reject their old heresy, however, they were turned over to the secular authorities. Okay, what does that actually mean? Well, most of the time they were executed, usually by being burned at the stake. The Inquisition relied on the cooperation of secular authorities in order to function. They were the ones who held the accused during trial and who actually summoned them for their hearing. In terms of punishing the unrepentant, as well as those who returned to heresy after swearing to denounce it, they were turned over to the secular authorities because they continued to be a danger to society, and the church wasn't allowed to spill blood, something Innocent III himself affirmed into canon law at the Fourth Lateran Council. But again, this was seen as a last resort, and some people were against it altogether, including William of Ockham, who's probably most famous for his love of shaving or something. Others, like Thomas Aquinas, arguably the most important philosopher and theologian in the Middle Ages, accepted the death penalty, but far preferred life imprisonment or exile, since then the heretic was never denied the chance to see the truth and repent. Speaking of which, exile was also done on occasion, and the heretic usually had their property confiscated and their relatives could be banned from public office. The specifics of what happened depended on the secular laws of the region, though most rulers took heresy just as seriously as religious authorities did, which meant execution was often the course of action. The laws of Frederick II stated that a heretic could be spared if fear of death caused them to repent at the very last second, even if they were in the process of being burned. But in this case, their tongue was to be cut out to prevent them from spreading their heresy. When there was an execution, it was highly public, for the exact same reason as public penance. It was a warning to other heretics to repent, and to the faithful, it was a reminder of the hellfire that awaited those who turned to heresy. Heretics were also frequently dressed in a way that emphasized their sinfulness, including paper hats which became popular in the late Middle Ages depicting demons, like the one put on Jan Hus during his execution in 1415. Of course, in this case, Hus's followers saw him as a martyr despite the hat, which was always a danger and one of the reasons why executions were not the ideal outcome. In terms of exact numbers of people handed over to the secular authorities, it's hard to know with 100% certainty. But by and large, outside of the times and places where there was a big surge in heresy, like in southern France around the time of the Albigensian Crusade, in Bohemia and the areas around there after the death of Jan Hus, and in England in the late 14th and early 15th century with the Lollards, generally speaking, numbers of executions remained fairly low. They seem to have averaged somewhere around 5% of all those found guilty of heresy, and in some regions this averages out to about one execution per year. Though, again, this is far from a perfect estimate, and it might have been higher or lower in reality. But how did people at the time see the Inquisition? Well, most seem to have been fine with it. Like I've said multiple times, heresy was considered to be a real danger, and one that needed to be dealt with, and the Inquisition was proof that the Church took it seriously. The thoroughness of the inquisitorial process was also seen as a good way to reduce the frequency of people being falsely condemned for heresy, and to increase the number of converts back to the Catholic fold. Now, this isn't to say that no one ever had issues with it, but those who did were usually opposed to a specific verdict or even an individual inquisitor who was thought to be abusive, not to the Inquisition itself. Earlier, I mentioned Konrad von Marburg as being one inquisitor who was excessive in doling out the death penalty, shortly after Gregory IX made inquisitions independent from local churches. There was another man too, Robert le Bougre, who was accused of the same thing around the same time. Several bishops complained about these two and were opposed to them, but not the Inquisition in general. They just wanted oversight in order to prevent further abuses. This is why various popes went back and forth with the Inquisition's autonomy until the Council of Vienne in 1311-1312, when, as I mentioned earlier, it was definitively decided that an inquisitor's verdict had to be approved by the local bishop. Likewise, the trial of Languedoc-Beguines in 1318-1321 caused local outrage. But the people were mad at the injustice of that particular trial, and of the Pope, not at the Inquisition more generally. Even people who might be opposed to the Pope, like Frederick II in many cases, were still willing to cooperate with them in the inquisitorial process. And being closely allied to the Pope didn't guarantee that you wouldn't have problem with specific inquisitors. The Florentines, for example, who were often very close allies to the Pope in conflicts in Italy, still kicked out several inquisitors from their city who they thought were meddling too much in local politics. The only people who were really against the Inquisition were likely the heretics themselves, though of course they were also against the Catholic Church as a whole in most cases. As problematic as the Inquisition might seem to us today, people in the Middle Ages don't seem to have really had a problem with it. People weren't living in constant fear of the Inquisition, and in fact, most people were probably more worried about heretics than they were about inquisitors. Alright, once again, that's going to conclude this video. I had planned on touching on the Spanish, Portuguese, and Roman Inquisitions in this video, but they really deserve their own, and I didn't think that I'd have enough time to really say anything significant about them here. In any case, if you like this video, I encourage you to give it a like and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.